Well, hello and welcome to the IEA's YouTube channel and to the second episode in our Foreign Affairs series, where we look at foreign affairs and international relations from a classical liberal perspective. I'm Steve Davies, the Head of Education at the IEA, and I'm delighted to be joined by Imran Ahmad, the MP for Wakefield since 2019, and also the Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Foreign Affairs. So welcome and hello.
Thank you very much, Steve. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning.
So we're at an interesting moment in time when discussing trade policy and its place in foreign relations, because, of course, since 1973 until just a year ago, Britain's trade policy was essentially outsourced to first the EEC and then the EU. Now, historically, free trade was always the central feature of the classical liberal approach to international relations, in the sense that it was both the central feature of British foreign policy up until 1931, and also the goal of British policy to encourage as many countries as possible to adopt it. Now, given that we now have all these options open to us as a country, having left the EU to shape our trade policy, do you think we should revert to that approach? And if so, why?
I think, Steve, you've raised a very, very interesting point, and you're quite right to state that free trade was one of the principal objectives of British foreign policy. And I think we really do have a great opportunity now, freed from the shackles of the European Union, to engage and conduct that policy again. I've often said that Britannia's trident has three prongs, and those three prongs are composed of diplomacy, development, and trade, free trade. And if we don't employ them all together and in unison, we're leaving poor Britannia stranded upon a rock, hand-fisted. So it's incredibly important. There's many, many reasons why it is important. First of all, free trade is about freedom. And there's nothing in history has raised the living standards and raised as many people out of poverty as free trade. I mean, since 1950, for example, economic prosperity has been massively energized and accelerated. GDP in 1950 was just over $4 billion US. It's now just under 87 billion US, 87,000 billion US dollars, forgive me. And world exports increased from 62,000 billion in 1950 to 17, just under 18,000 billions in 2017. Now, in 1915, out of entire population of about 2.5 billion in the world, about 1.8 billion of those, so way over half, were living their lives in extreme poverty. In 2015, our global population had catapulted to over about 7.5 million, 7.3 or so billion people, and only 0.7 billions lived in extreme poverty. Why? Because of trade, free trade. Because free trade allows for a more efficient allocation of goods and resources. It allows for competitive advantage. It creates naturally a more competitive environment that ensures resources are used as efficiently as possible and allocated where they are most effective. Domestic firms do face increased competition from other countries, which creates incentives to cut costs and increase efficiency and invest and raise productivity. And ultimately, it's people, you and I, ordinary people in countries around the world, that benefit from a greater selection of goods and services at better prices, and it spurs on inventiveness and competition. And of course, then it leads to transfers of knowledge, technology, and the benefits cannot be overstated. And where people wish to go about to increase aid for instance, it's nothing as a help to improve human condition and human living around the world as free trade. And there's also these great, huge numbers of non-economic benefits, but actually, I must say that there's no such thing as a non-economic benefit because they do. So the transfers of culture from other countries, of knowledge, but also if one is helping a developing country and you're increasing the wealth of a developing country and increasing trade in a developing country, you're also generating, as a byproduct, a burgeoning middle class who are getting richer and wealthier, educating their children better, creating businesses. Now, as soon as people begin to own things, they take a greater role in the running of their country. And they make sure they have an interest to ensure that the local police force is less corrupt, that government is more responsive to their needs. And by doing that, you're actually improving the quality of life and the conditions upon which whole countries exist. And therefore, you're also reducing the need for people to have to leave their countries and immigrate to other countries in order to fulfill their quite natural ambitions to improve their lot and their family's lot and their children's lot, or to flee persecution. Because free trade actually delivers and allows people, enables people better to live, work, and worship as they wish. So all of these things are interconnected. And when people talk about extending the writ of the state, promoting democracy, ensuring that people are able to live, work, and worship as they wish, I honestly do believe that the best driver to secure these noble aspirations and policies are free trade. So I take a terribly expansive view as to what free trade is and why we should do it. It's not just enriching us, it enriches everybody. And arguably, it enriches poorest countries best and allows them to accelerate out of poverty and become developed countries. Because of course, it's in our interest to have developed countries, because I want wealthy countries throughout Africa and Asia to buy Jaguars, Range Rovers, and Mulberry handbags, and also to benefit from their raw materials and their finished goods. Now, I think an interesting question would be, what are the parameters of free trade? Because an asymmetrical relationship with certain trading states isn't free trade, because free trade works well, as I've said, if you're a capitalist. Because what defines, in my mind, you may disagree, you're far more learned than I, Steve, but what defines free trade in my mind is the free, voluntary exchange of goods and services. And that is very markedly different from mercantilism and mercantilists, where there is an element of subjection. There are many on the left who misunderstand capitalism, and I think they need to go back to their economic history, and they will blame capitalism as being exploitative, and it's not, it's voluntary. And where you have slavery, it's mercantilism. And even today, I would not be pressing for free trade with, I don't know, North Korea, or possibly the junta of Burma, or the Chinese Communist Party and its treatment of Uyghurs, Falun Gong, Christians, and others, because that's about enslaving people, allowing forced labor to corrupt and infect supply chains, and then it makes us, freedom-loving countries and societies, complicit in such crimes. So there must be parameters, agreed. But as a concept, capitalism, marked by the voluntary exchange of goods and services, and free trade, I think is nothing but unmitigated progress and positive advances in the world.
Okay. Now, thanks very much for that. And as a proud Mancunian, I'm delighted to hear something straight out of Cobden and Bright from you there. And the Manchester School alive and well, I'm glad to see. I mean, you've
As a proud
basically,
Yorkshireman, I had to give you something.
indeed, yes, I'm sure. So you've made 3 points there basically. The first is the economic benefits and the crucial part that freer trade plays in international development, and the benefits it brings both to rich countries, but also perhaps even more so to poor countries in terms of development. Secondly, you spoke about the non-economic benefits of free trade in terms of things like greater international connections at a human level as well as an economic level, the flow of ideas, things of that sort. And then you finally sort of posited a tension between this and relations with what you describe as mercantilist countries, which I suppose, again, to give a historical example, would be like the question of, well, should Britain have been trading freely with, say, slave-produced goods from the Caribbean colonies, or later on from the Confederacy or the states that became the Confederacy? So if you don't mind, I'd like to go through each of those three, I mean, explore these a bit more. So you make a strong case, which I personally agree with, that free trade is a central element in any policy of global development, which we would want to see for all sorts of reasons, both humanitarian but also security reasons,
Mm-hmm.
given the connection, which obviously your background you're well aware of, between economic distress and things like terrorism and organized crime and the like, given you have a background in counterterrorism. On the other hand, as you well know, there's this contrary view that what's going on with free trade at the moment is the kind of export of jobs and other economic activity from wealthy countries to developing countries. This is the line that Donald Trump was pushing while he was president of the United States. It's been taken up by a number of other people in the Republican Party. It's not without support, as I may say, in the Conservative Party, let's say, or the Labour Party. So what's your response to that, given what you said previously?
Well, I think, first of all, there is a difference. But again, this is why we need to be clear on the language and the terms. Mercantilism restricts imports and relies on protectionism to save domestic industries or domestic jobs, if you wish to put it down to jobs. And free trade will accept that there'll be a comparative advantage, and nations should focus on the thing that they have a slight comparative advantage on. Mm. And that in itself develops and builds more jobs. Also, there's an ebb and flow in various issues. Now, of course, if there are other reasons, I actually personally don't accept that restricting the imports of to and from free countries is a good thing in any way. And I don't believe it actually does save jobs. I think it costs jobs, because also there's a cost. There's a cost to gross subsidies and restricting people to import. That cost is inhibiting the economic development of a country that has an advantage in producing said items or services, and B, making your own countrymen and businesses have to buy more expensive and often worse quality goods and services because you're restricting choice. Now, put into that, and then those other industries dependent will lose their comparative advantage with what they're producing. So I find the argument, though it may be superficially attractive, I think it's like it's actually rather cancerous. It metastasizes and corrupts the entire corpus. So I think it's really best to excise it straight away by saying, no, it's not a sticky plaster. It doesn't help. It actually is going to ultimately eat away at our country, at our economy, and indeed inhibit people from fulfilling their own potential, whether in our country or their own. And we must know, as Britain, we have this wonderful, on these islands, we have this wonderful history where we've always been at the head of all these ventures. You know, after the Black Death, and we had a poverty of labor in the rural areas, prices went up of labor, productivity increased, people, the landowners paid higher wages, people increased, had better systems. We had the Green Revolution. Investment was made into plants and machinery, into better hoes and plows and so on. We then had better number of amounts of crops. The population increased. We had a surplus of population, which led to urbanization. Ultimately, we had the Industrial Revolution. We have service-led revolution, now the post-service environment. It's always because we've actually embraced opportunities, and we haven't seen them like scaredy cats as challenges. They are opportunities. And as long as you are possessed of some form of genius, you can take advantage of all of these challenges, make them into opportunity. The obverse side of risk is reward. And by limiting risk by foolish policies is removing our potential of reward. And I often think with government policy, you should follow the line of wise medics who, when they see a patient by the side of a road after an accident, will say, first, do no harm. Let's not immediately try to respond in some sort of knee-jerk reaction and help when that could actually cause damage to the patient. It's one of the things I learned. You referenced my experience overseas doing in countries with opaque with systems of governance and where terrorism was a problem. With terrorists and extremist ideology, I'd always say, first, do no harm. Understand what the situation is, and then make sure many of these ideas, whether it's communism or radical extremist ideology, are predicated upon bad ideas and will ultimately fail and fall upon the weight of their own toxic ideology. So what we don't want to do is breathe fresh oxygen into the patient. We want to exclude all possibilities of new oxygen into them. So don't give them new oxygen often by trying with all the best of intentions. The road to hell is paved with them, after all. With best of intentions, we have often given new breath to these monsters.
Yeah.
So I actually think that we need to very, very cautiously approach and not to assist. That's a slight tangent, forgive me. You can bring it back on track.
I think that's relevant because it fits in with the argument that this is not just about economic development, but that it's also part of a security or international relations policy, the creation of a particular kind of international order which will reduce systemic threats to liberal democratic ways of life by undercutting the conditions for the emergence of other ways. Now, I mean, obviously, I agree with the arguments you've made there, and I would add that the kind of argument we have been getting is essentially a zero-sum argument, in which the view is that one part of the world can only really become wealthy at the expense of other parts of the world. Whereas, as you said in some of your earlier remarks, if other parts of the world become wealthy, it provides opportunities for British producers of things like, Land Rovers and Jaguars to sell to those wealthy consumers, which was, of course, Cobden's argument. Now, I'd go to the third point for the moment, where you mentioned, that you think that there has to be a kind of framework for the policy, so that if as part of foreign policy we're pursuing a goal of free trade in the UK in our post-Brexit situation, the question you sort of posed was, how do we deal with countries? You mentioned Myanmar, for example, and also obviously the big case, China, which are pursuing what is essentially a form of neo-mercantilism. Now, the argument against your position you're saying, as I understand you, and that you'll correct me if I'm wrong, is that we should make a kind of exception to the general rule of free trade. We should be maybe not extending a complete free trade policy to countries that follow an oppressive and mercantilist route. Now, what do you say to the counter argument that in fact it is engagement, economic and otherwise, with those countries that is ultimately going to change them? And if we don't follow completely free trade or open door policy, therefore, with countries like China, what do we do?
Well, you see, I've heard the argument. I don't necessarily accept it, because I don't see economics as some separate science or art by itself that doesn't impact human life. I see it as being absolutely intrinsic to human life and human dignity and the value of human life. And free trade should not be granted, in my opinion, to every trading partner. Rather, as I touched on before, it should be conducted within certain parameters. I think nations or states that are being controlled by political juntas and other such things that are openly hostile to our values of freedom, pluralism, democracy, tolerance, should not be granted free trade agreements. Because particularly in today's globalized market of interconnected supply chains, we become complicit with their crimes. And I certainly do not believe that the people of Wakefield, where I'm speaking from right now, would wish, because they are manufacturing something or other or purchasing something, would wish to be in any way, shape or form connected to slave labor being conducted in a certain state, because we haven't taken actions to ensure that our supply chains are free of that sin and that absolute motor driver of human misery. I think that free trade is all about limiting and restricting human misery and promoting freedom and joy. It really is a means of liberating the soul, liberating the individual. And so on a basic philosophical and ideological basis, it would be nonsensical to trade with a party that we know are mercantilist, where there is no freedom, and that it is actually subjecting people to slavery, and where the voluntary, and it's so important, the voluntary exchange of goods and services is not part of that supply chain. I don't want a part of it. And that, I think, would be the best way for states that are not necessarily intrinsically see the value of individuals, of their citizens or subjects as being fiercely important, will change their minds. The story over the last 25 years or so has been one where we have become complicit in the massive economic uplift of states, hoping that engagement would get them to temper and change their view. And I think it was legitimate for us to experiment and try that. It's failed. In 1997, when we handed over Hong Kong and the new territories to the People's Republic of China, Hong Kong accounted to just over 20% of the total of China's GDP. Today, I think it's around 2% or so. It's incredibly, it's far, far smaller. And that's not because Hong Kong's become less important, it's because China has massively increased. But has the Communist Party been imbued with those Hong Kong Chinese values of freedom, enterprise, and tolerance and personal dignity? I would suggest that the evidence suggests it hasn't. And so maybe other drivers need to be employed in order to prompt people to realize that economic increase without human and personal benefit is actually not is not tolerable.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks for that. I mean, the very clear answer, I think. I mean, you're clearly saying that free trade needs to be part of a larger package deal of what you might call a broad geopolitical strategy, basically. So, pushing on from that in a way, what if indeed Western countries like the UK and other liberal democracies are engaged in what you might call a system competition with the model of development that the Chinese state currently represents, the People's Republic? What part does it play in, if you like, turning other parts of the world more towards our model than towards the alternative Chinese model. In particular, I'm thinking about um, the great arc of rather fragile states that stretches from Central Asia right through the Middle East and across Sahelian Africa, where, according to the World Fragile State Index, there are lots of states there which are seriously dysfunctional. It's not a matter of a repressive state as much as one that just isn't really able to do its core function. So if there's a kind of competition between the West and liberal democracies and the People's Republic as for different models of social and economic development, what part might free trade play in winning the battle in that kind of battleground area, do you think?
Well, I think we do have to provide an alternative. The Belt and Road Initiative is, I think, wonderfully ambitious, but I think it's rather dangerous. Not dangerous necessarily to our concept of free Western capitalism, but dangerous to the subject countries involved in the Belt and Road, because they're in, and I use the word subject deliberately. If you look at Sri Lanka and the way the debt that it amassed and the port that is now Chinese, if you go to Pakistan and the port of Gwadar is now Chinese, these are not, in Africa, you go across West or East Africa and the roads everywhere are being built by the Chinese, yet the countries involved are amassing great debts for them. These are not acts of liberation and achievement for those states. This is being mired in debt and subject then to further influence and control by a country that may not be that altruistic. Whereas if your wealth and your development is going to be driven by the free and voluntary exchange of goods and services, where you're going to make money selling stuff and buying things and so on, I don't see anybody in that relationship necessarily having the whip hand. And removing the whip hand, I think, is an important part of free trade. And that's why I don't think free trade requires political unity or political blocks necessarily. And I think one of the biggest beneficiaries, groups of beneficiaries for true free trade, are going to be those small, medium-sized countries in that arc that you so graphically present, because it's what's going to be their route out of poverty and instability. Again, if we trade with that great arc, and if we buy their goods and services and sell with them, and we have the transfer of our cultures, ideas, knowledge, technology, it builds them up, boosts them. And of course, it allows us, good, strong, reliable partners, to purchase things that we require and sell things that we wish to sell to them. So on every single front, and I don't believe that I'm an ideological sort of blowhard, but I truly don't see a downside of free trade based upon capitalism, the free exchange of goods and services. And I would also see that as being the greatest driver when we do it, and we do it effectively, and we treat people with respect and engage them. By people, I mean states. I think they will see the benefits are vast, and then other countries that we wish to influence will see actually that's the model that they need to adopt. And that's the way that the engagement works, because of course I wish to trade with China. China is a great country with a great culture. It's an intrinsic part of our human story and our common cultural civilization as humans. It's an intrinsic part. There is no sort of xenophobia or indeed against any other regime, whether it's North Korea or any other illiberal or despotic regime that doesn't value the rights of individuals. But to get on to an earlier point you raised, I think that's how we do influence them and get them to change their tone. If they see actually there is benefit in adopting this model for them and their people, and they increase productivity, they increase happiness and joy, they can increase their trade with people if it is voluntary and not compulsion driven. That's how things get changed, I believe.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, to return finally to the sort of second point you made in your initial sort of remarks about the non-economic benefits of free trade. Free trade, if you like, as part of a wider uh, sort of set of human relations, if you will, that cross geopolitical borders. Richard Cobden famously, argued, of course, that the reason why he wanted to repeal the Corn Laws and move to a policy of free trade was because he thought it would help bring about international peace and amity, partly because of the greater interconnections it would lead to. Do you think that argument is still true? And also, don't you think that that implies in the modern context that as well as goods moving around the world, you need other things, notably people, to be able to move more freely in order to get the full range of benefits of that kind?
Well, I'm a conservative. My party was born out of the Corn Laws, and free trade should be our DNA. And Cobden's pursuit to get rid of the Corn Laws is one that I wholeheartedly support. And if I was there at the time, I'd be certainly paying homage to him in person. But in terms of his other expectations, they're quite reasonable expectations to have. I'm not as convinced whether it's the route through to peace and prosperity. If we look at this is why freedom and human dignity and participation in states is so important. If we look at one people entirely the same, the British of the 13 colonies and the British of the British Isles and the war that we had, and then in 1812, the war between the Canadians and a million of them actually left after the defeat at Yorktown and moved to Canada, a third of the US population of the 13 colonies at the time. There was pretty free movement of trade and goods and services and so on. It didn't stop because there is a matter of actually wanting to be in charge of your own system of government. Who makes the rules and who takes your money is very, very important. That's I think it's always going to remain. I think free trade can help increase fraternal relations between countries and peoples. It certainly does increase the interactions between people, and then we were talking earlier about cultures and so on. But I'm not as strong on the direct line. And there are many that would say, "Oh, but look at the peace that fell out of in Europe after 1945 with the Steel and Coal Union and EEC, EU, and so on." And I will say, yes, quite rightly. But there is also our NATO alliance that was set up around the same time, and of course the collective security structure of the United Nations, both of which can't be discounted, and particularly I'm an Atlanticist, NATO certainly not. So although I do massively believe in many of the advantages of free trade, and I think it can go towards increasing understanding and reducing risks to war, it certainly is not a recipe to entirely mitigate the risk of an absence of peace existing between peoples.
Mm. Okay. Thanks. Do you have anything else you'd like to say at this point? Anything you feel that you'd like to add to what's already been said?
No, not at all, Steve.
Oh, well, thanks very much. Well, I mean, I would just say that it's good to hear somebody speaking from the Peelite tradition within the Conservative Party. I think it's fair to say, as opposed to the one of Joseph Chamberlain, which you've had allusions to in the more recent past. I just sort of like conclude by saying really that
the Peelite tradition, but at the moment I have ringlets like Dizzy.
That's very true indeed. Absolutely. So it is worth saying that, hopefully free trade will once again have a major part to play in Britain's view of the world and the part it sees itself as playing. And it there is one sort of final question I just quickly put to you, which is at the moment we do hear word that the kind of international trade agreements that have dominated world trade policy really since GATT was set up immediately after
Mhm.
World War II are starting to come under increasing pressure, and that they're becoming increasingly difficult to realize because of their sheer complexity and the degree to which they're subject to things like capture by business interests and like. Do you think that perhaps the time has come to start trying to think about and maybe explore different ways of getting freer trade between countries than these rather elaborate regulatory harmonization deals that we've had for the last 50, 60 years?
If only we could. And if there is a way, we should certainly
Mhm.
explore it. Because somehow, I may just be a simpleton, but it somehow takes away, doesn't it, from the idea of free trade?
Mhm.
When you
Yeah,
when there's all these regulations and rules and so on, it's less free trade than somewhat managed trade.
exactly. Yeah.
And I believe in free trade, not managed. You know, other than, of course, restricting the flow of illicit goods into a nation, but that's separate from these discussions. Um, you know, since Christmas to now, we under the Secretary of State for International Trade, Liz Truss, we have now concluded in excess of 60, I think, trade agreements with non-EU nation states, which have taken effect. Um, and although it's been done at great speed, and there's been a lot of them that have just rolled over and so on from previous agreements, it does seem like an awful lot of effort and time. And wouldn't it be lovelier if we were able to say, we are going to accept from all, as long as people meet X, Y, and Z measures, they're free, they don't involve slavery and the subjection of
Mm.
forced labor and so on. All of your goods and services sold to our country will be free, as long as all of our goods and services are free to you. Um, uh, but I think we're someplace somewhat removed from that at the moment.
Yeah.
Um, and the trouble with international structures between governments is that once they're set up, they're very difficult to undo. I
Yes.
mean, if Mr. Friedman, Professor Friedman's line, which is as relevant today, if not more, than when he said it in regards to farmers' subsidies in the Midwest, when we're talking about COVID, that there is no such thing as permanent as a temporary government intervention initiative. I mentioned it to the Chancellor of the Exchequer the other day in regards to the universal credit £20 uplift. It's if that is relevant to nation states within their own territory, I think it probably goes twice as much when it comes to international treaties and compacts. So it'd be a wonderful thing to be able to extricate ourselves from that. But I think it's something of a Gordian knot.
Indeed. Well, we do know how that particular problem was solved rather swiftly. Anyway, thank you very much. And
Well, that's the good thing of radical conservative policies. That
yes,
ultimately conservatism is at its best when it's at its most radical.
yeah,
And and free trade, it may have been around for a long time now, but I think it's just as radical today as when Cobden was talking about it.
indeed. Well, thank you very much for that. And for all of you out there watching this program, thanks very much for taking part. And if you've enjoyed it, I hope you will subscribe to the IEA's YouTube channel. And if you feel motivated or inspired to support us, we would welcome your support. And donations can always be sent, which we gladly accept, to iea.org.uk. So thank you very much.